You may have heard me drone on and on about this thing called reflective thinking. We philosophers and cognitive scientists are pretty preoccupied with it. But we lack a definition of reflective thinking that can serve both philosophers and scientists. Because I do both philosophy and cognitive science, I've had to synthesize a measurable construct from fields like philosophy and psychology. In this episode, I'll read my latest paper, which explains the two key features of reflection and how we measure them. This two-factor account of reflective thinking can unify centuries of English language scholarship, and it has implications for theories of rationality, self-knowledge, and so-called dual systems. As always, free preprints of all my papers are available on my CV at byrdnick.com/CV under Publications. This episode's affiliate partner is Coursera. Coursera has something for everyone: students, teachers, schools, companies, and even governments. Find out how they can serve your educational needs at the link in this episode's description. If you liked the Upon Reflection podcast, subscribe wherever you find podcasts, leave a review, or just tell people about it. You can find and follow my daily posts about cognitive science on Blue Sky at byrdnick.com, on Mastodon at byrdnick, and all the other platforms. Comments and questions can be submitted at byrdnick.com/contact. A two-factor explication of reflection, unifying, making sense of, and guiding the philosophy and science of reflective reasoning. Abstract. Reflective reasoning has been central to philosophy and cognitive science more generally. However, scholars lack a unified empirical explication of reflection. This paper synthesizes a cross-disciplinary account from philosophers, scientists, and centuries of English speakers. Reflection often refers to, among other things, conscious and deliberate reconsideration of our initial intuition. This two-factor account of reflection empirically distinguishes reflection from often conflated phenomena such as rumination. It also tidily classifies self-conscious reflection as a subset of reflection. This account also accommodates mounting evidence that reflection is neither necessary nor sufficient for rationality. The two-factor account has implications for philosophy, such as that both practical and theoretical reasoning can benefit from reflection, as well as science, such as the idea that reflection can be a solution rather than just a symptom of negative rumination. So the two-factor account should be preferred to accounts that do less to unify, make sense of, and even guide philosophy and science. Epigraph. Quote, "The idea that P is so intuitive that most will need no more proof than its statement." End quote. Quote, "It seems reasonable that P, however, let us reflect." End quote. Quote, "Traditional dual process approaches assume an advanced role for type 2 reflective processing in reducing biases produced by type 1 intuitive processing." End quote. Section 1. Reflection in Philosophy and Science. Our first response to a question is often unreflective. For example, if a highly accurate test indicates that you're positive for a rare health condition, are you probably positive? Many people intuitively accept this test result based on the test's accuracy, neglecting the condition's base rate. However, we could step back and reflect on our intuitions. I know this test is accurate, but how does the rarity of the condition impact my test result? Stopping to think more reflectively can either change our mind or fortify our initial intuition. Upon reflection, the condition is so rare that my test result is probably a false positive, despite the test's accuracy. Why does this distinction between intuitive and reflective thinking matter? Not only can reflective thinking improve decisions, reflection is a remarkably popular concept in the history of ideas. Intuition and reflection have featured centrally in philosophy since at least Aristotle. For example, our capacity to, quote, back up and bring an impulse into view, end quote, has been considered crucial for foundational concepts like normativity, responsibility, and even inquiry. Of course, not all philosophers are in the business of empirically detecting the phenomena they study. So in philosophy, the word reflection is often described in merely metaphorical or folk psychological terms. For instance, quote, even the judgments we take provisionally as fixed points are liable to be pruned and adjusted, end quote. Distinguishing intuition from reflection is rife in cognitive science as well. Alas, dual process theorists have associated the distinction with too many orthogonal dichotomies for a unified empirical classification scheme. Such snowballing lists of, quote, binary oppositions, end quote, have been thought to suppress nuance. So one way to advance the philosophy and science of reflection is to agree on a more empirical and unified explication of the word reflection. This paper will synthesize a two-factor analysis from philosophy, cognitive science, and centuries of English language. The result is an account that can spare us from conflating reflection with concepts like self-consciousness or rumination. More importantly, the two-factor account is empirically tractable, allowing it to unify, make sense of, and even guide both philosophers and scientists. Section 2. Reflection and its cousins. Fast and slow, easy and effortful, associative and rule-based. Suppose we reduce dual process theorists' proliferating lists of opposing binaries down to two axes: consciousness and deliberateness. Shea and Frith provide us with such a 2x2 matrix, which allows us to distinguish reflective reasoning from more implicit, ruminative, and reformative cognition. Many common forms of thinking can be helpfully sorted into these four categories. Importantly, some of these categories are often conflated, so it's worth elaborating on each kind of cognition to emphasize how it differs from the others. Section 2.1. Implicit cognition. Implicit cognition is neither conscious nor deliberate, so it is unreflective. Implicit cognition might have impacts on our dispositions and judgments and beliefs, decisions, or behavior, independent of the impacts of other kinds of cognition. For instance, our implicit cognition might bias our behaviors in ways that we don't realize. You might be thinking of how implicit associations are supposed to influence our behaviors in ways that we allegedly don't realize. We should be careful here. It's one thing to include the word implicit in the name of a psychometric tool, perhaps because something about the tool or the process of its measurement is indirect. It's quite another to show that the psychological attribute measured by the tool is implicit. The present paper does not take a position on whether the implicit association test measures something implicit or whether the process by which it measures behavior is implicit. Given that implicit cognition is not consciously represented, we might find ourselves disagreeing with it if we become consciously aware of it or its impacts. Further, if we become aware of unreflective cognition frequently enough, then we might be able to anticipate it based on situational cues that match previous encounters with it. Moreover, if we anticipate this implicit cognition, then we might deliberately and consciously attempt to inhibit it. That is, we might challenge our unreflective cognition with reflective reasoning. For example, when our behavior is implicitly biased in ways that we reflectively disavow, we can become anxious about contexts in which our behavior might be implicitly biased. This anxiety might be related to another kind of thinking, ruminative thinking. Section 2.2. Ruminative thinking. Rumination is conscious but not deliberate. There are many modes to rumination. For example, when we find ourselves autonomically and repeatedly thinking about the great news that we received earlier, we are experiencing positive rumination. Perhaps rumination can also be neutral, as in certain cases of conscious mind wandering. Nonetheless, rumination can also be negative. Negative rumination predicts a wide range of maladaptive cognition. One proposed treatment for negative rumination is a form of reflective reasoning. It's most common in the cognitive behavioral therapy tradition. The reasoning is often described as, quote, putting one's thoughts on trial, end quote. It's an instance of reflective reasoning because it involves deliberately processing conscious representations. In particular, it involves deliberately subjecting one's consciously represented thoughts to scrutiny. So, for example, we can question the background assumptions of our negative rumination. And when we reflectively realize that the underlying assumptions of negative rumination are often impoverished or false, we may thereby interrupt self-reinforcing negative cycles. Although this reflective realization is helpful in the moment, it might not fully resolve the effects of rumination in the long run. That may require reformative cognition. Section 2.3, Reformative Cognition. Reformative cognition is unconscious but deliberate. For instance, one might gradually reform their unconscious stereotypes about another group of people by deliberatively exposing oneself to counter-stereotypic representations of those people. And these deliberative attempts to intervene on one's autonomous social impulses can lead to interactions that decrease one's negative stereotypes about other groups. Of course, decisions to befriend someone from another group can be deliberate even if we're not consciously aware of the subsequent changes to our stereotypes about that group. For example, we might deliberately modify our social habits so that we meet and sustain relationships with people who are very different from us. And if these interactions go well, then it may ameliorate a negative stereotype about those people who are different from us. Still, we do not always represent stereotypes consciously, so we do not always notice when the stereotype is updated by these interactions. We might not even consciously represent the processes that update the stereotype. We may only be aware of the antecedent positive experiences and memories. So even though positive interactions with people from another group can be deliberate, the resulting updates to mental representations may not be consciously represented. Of course, not all reformative unconscious cognition is so ameliorative. Suppose our homophily becomes deliberate in some circumstances, as when we momentarily pause before opting to interact with a group of people who look and think more like us than another nearby group of people. This deliberate decision decreases the probability of positive interactions with people that are different from us, so we miss an opportunity to ameliorate our unconscious representations of the other groups. Section 3. Reflection as conscious and deliberate. Why might we want to think of reflection as deliberate and consciously represented reasoning? Well, first, tests of reflective thinking tend to track those two features. Second, classic descriptions of reflection tend to include both features, such as Korsgaard's, quote, back up and bring an impulse into view, end quote. Table 2 reviews many other examples of the word reflect that seem to involve deliberate and conscious reasoning. Of course, identifying these features in the English language is relatively easy. The harder task is explicating the observable and measurable aspects of these features. So the remainder of this section attempts to clarify for philosophers and scientists what we mean by and how we detect these two features. Section 3.1, Conscious Representation. Reasoning is conscious just in case the reasoner consciously represents parts of their reasoning. By consciously represent, I mean that the representation is available for processing at the personal level. One way to test whether contents are available at the personal level is to see if the contents can be articulated verbally. So if someone can concurrently, as opposed to reactively, think aloud, then at least the verbalized contents of their reasoning are consciously represented. We can unpack each part of this explication of the word conscious below. Section 3.1.1, Processing at the personal level. Daniel Dennett's personal-subpersonal distinction refers to levels of analysis and explanation. The distinction is between folk psychological states and the mechanistic explanations thereof. So when someone asks, quote, "What is pain?" end quote, we can give at least two kinds of answer. One kind of answer simply describes one's pains, how one knows that they're in pain, when one is likely to experience pain, and so on. This is explanation at the personal level. Another kind of explanation itemizes the physiological events in the causal chain involved in pain. This is explanation at the non-personal level. The personal-subpersonal distinction can be applied to explanation as well as it can be applied to mental processing. The idea is that a person can be somewhat aware of the processing of mental representations, such as when you're aware of the meaning of this sentence. Moreover, a person can consciously reason about the representations of which they are aware, such as you thinking of an objection to what you're currently listening to. And when someone is so aware of processing representations that they can reason about them, then we can say that their representations are available for processing at the personal level. In short, they are conscious. This, of course, contrasts with unconscious or subpersonal representations, representations that someone is not so aware of that they can reason about them. For instance, we seem unable to consciously process certain visual stimuli that are presented for only a few milliseconds. So if these representations are processed at all, it may sound strange to say that persons are doing the processing. Rather, something subpersonal, like brains or neurons or the like, is doing the processing. Thus, we call these subpersonal representations. Section 3.1.2, Conscious awareness of what? Consciousness has a few meanings in philosophy. For instance, some distinguish between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. Some evidence suggests that the phenomenal consciousness, that is, what it's like to be conscious, is not a widespread concept. Indeed, the kind of consciousness we have found in ordinary philosophical and scientific language has been access consciousness, conscious representations of our thoughts, attitudes, and other mental contents. We can distinguish between consciously representing the source of one's reasoning, or the contents of one's reasoning, or even the impact of one's reasoning. In the present paper, when I refer to conscious representations, I'm referring to representations of content awareness, that is, conscious awareness of the contents of reasoning. Consciousness of only the source or impact of one's reasoning would not constitute the kind of conscious representation that features in reflective reasoning. So the conscious representations that feature in reflective reasoning are those from the so-called black box of reasoning's content. Some debates in philosophy hinge in part on what contents of reasoning can count as a reason. This paper's analysis of reflective reasoning does not require this so-called deliberative constraint on reasons. Nonetheless, philosophers who defend such constraints may want to defend a corresponding reflective constraint to, say, rule out that one could be reflecting about what to believe when they're consciously considering something that doesn't seem to count as a reason, such as a bribe. Section 3.1.3, Verbal Report and Conscious Representation. Concurrent verbal report can be crucial for understanding how people complete tasks, including reflection tests. Among other things, such think-aloud protocol analysis reveals some of the representations that are conscious during the task, or the approximate chronological order of the representations. Of course, there may be many unconscious representations involved in completing the task, even when we are thinking aloud. And because participants are not conscious of these representations, they will report about them inaccurately, if they report about them at all. Nonetheless, this is not a reason to think that all verbal reports are so inaccurate. After all, when participants confabulate an inaccurate story about their unconscious reasoning, we take it for granted that they are at least accurately reporting the representation of their confabulation. This raises a question about the cases in which we are conscious only of the conclusion of our reasoning, such as when we have an intuition unaccompanied by any explicit reasoning or argument. In that case, the antecedent reasoning is unconsciously processed. However unconscious the processing may be, it can be deliberate, as when we deliberately put ourselves in situations known to countercondition negative associations, even though we may not be consciously aware of the underlying associative processes. Section 3.2, Deliberate Processing. Reasoning is deliberate just in case one inhibits or does not immediately endorse their autonomous response. One common method of observing deliberateness involves giving someone a task that's known to elicit an autonomous response and instructing them to respond incongruently with their autonomous response. So if someone responds incongruently with the known autonomous response, then we can infer that they either inhibited that response or did not endorse it. That is, we can infer that their response was deliberate. We can unpack each part of this explication of deliberate below. Section 3.2.1, Inhibiting Autonomous Responses. Cognitive science may have introduced the concept of autonomic, which describes a process that, once started, can run to completion without conscious attention. Of course, autonomous processes can be started without deliberation. When something is presented to us, autonomous processing can produce a response without our consciously representing any of that processing. And if we immediately accept that response as soon as we consciously represent the response, such as when we just verbally report it as correct, then that response is not deliberate. If, however, we inhibit the processing that leads to that response, or do not immediately accept the response after it's consciously represented, then doing so is deliberate. Section 3.2.2, Rejecting Ballistic Responses. Logan and Cowan introduce ballistic processing as a special class of autonomous processing. Autonomous processing that not only can run to completion regardless of conscious attention, but will run to completion regardless of conscious attention. This means that ballistic responses cannot be inhibited or interrupted. And if responses were deliberate only when they were inhibited or interrupted, then ballistic responses would be deliberate by definition. But ballistically autonomous responses seem to be a paradigm case of non-deliberative processing. That's why we need to characterize deliberateness disjunctively. A response is deliberate when either it inhibits or does not immediately endorse an autonomous response. This disjunctive treatment allows us to classify both autonomous and ballistic responses in a way that's better fitting of our ordinary use of the word deliberate, even though ballistic responses cannot be inhibited. Of course, we may stop reflecting in the middle of reasoning about something, such as when we give up or get distracted. In these cases, one can deliberately begin to reflect without actually settling the question they set out to answer. So, even if reflection's purpose is to settle the answer to a question, reflection will not always complete this function. And Even if reflection is a way for us to exercise control, this two-factor account would not commit one, say, to the idea that reflection grounds free will or moral responsibility. Section 3.2.3, verbal report and deliberateness. We can observe deliberateness when we reason aloud. Suppose we give research participants a task and ask them to think aloud as they complete it. Immediately after reading the first question aloud, many participants say, "The answer is P," and begin reading the second question. These participants are not responding deliberately, so they're not responding reflectively. However, some participants finish reading the first question aloud and say something more reflective, like, "I think the answer is P, but is that right?" These participants are not immediately accepting their autonomous response, so they are responding deliberately, even if their ultimate response aligns with their autonomous response. Section 3.3. Not just classificatory, but also comparative. In reality, neither the consciousness nor the deliberateness of reasoning is binary. That is, it'd be difficult to draw a clear and categorical boundary between conscious reasoning and unconscious reasoning, or between deliberate and autonomous reasoning. After all, we might consciously represent only some part of our consciously representable reflective reasoning, and we might only partly inhibit or reject autonomous responses. So the consciousness and deliberateness of reasoning will likely come in degrees. What I'm suggesting is a, quote, comparative, end quote, rather than, quote, classificatory, end quote, analysis of reflective reasoning, a la Carnap. A classificatory analysis of reflection is one that allows us to say when a case of reasoning is or is not reflective. For example, X and Y are reflective, but Z is not. A comparative analysis of reflection, on the other hand, would allow us to say whether one case is more reflective than another. For instance, X is more reflective than Y. Perhaps a mature psychology of reasoning will be able to give a quantitative analysis of reflection. A quantitative analysis would allow us to index the degree to which cases of reasoning are reflective. For instance, a quantitative analysis might allow us to quantify the percentage of representations that were conscious during reasoning. One might think that because common tests of reflection do quantify differences in reflection, we already have quantitative analyses of reflective reasoning. Although these quantities usually track consciousness or deliberateness, they seem to exhibit substantial error rates. Section 4. Reflection versus self-reflection. Now that we have the two-factor account of reflective thinking and some insight about how to conceptually and empirically distinguish reflection from its cousins, we can begin to apply the framework. Consider how the framework can inform the distinction between reflection and reflective self-consciousness. Section 4.1. Reflection. The first kind of reflection is just a general form of reasoning about anything. Not just our mental states, but external or mind-independent phenomena as well. For example, when we're aware of not only the answer to a math problem, but also some of the steps that got us to the answer, we are reasoning consciously. Unsurprisingly, deliberate and conscious reasoning tends to be slower and more autonomous than unconscious reasoning. Of course, there may be exceptions to this. For instance, a chess expert's reflection about where to move a piece may occur about as fast as their more unreflective intuitions about where to move a piece. Indeed, while there are popular accounts of reflective thinking as, quote, slow, end quote, plenty of evidence suggests that reflective reasoning can be fast. Moreover, Socratic discussions that tend to improve decisions are not reliably longer on average than less effective solitary reasoning. Section 4.2, Self-conscious. While reflective reasoning is conscious, it is not necessarily self-conscious. This is because we can consciously reason about things other than our own minds. as John Doris remarks, quote, reflection can cover introspective and extrospective processes, end quote. For example, when I multiply 13 by 17, I'm not consciously representing these numbers as my representations of these numbers. I'm simply representing the numbers. My so-called self is not represented in the calculation. In other words, when we reason reflectively, we may consciously represent something from our mind's perspective, but we are not thereby consciously representing our mind, its perspective, or its contents. So what is self-conscious reflection? Imagine a psychologist describes patterns in your thoughts and feelings about your father. As you focus on the thoughts and feelings you discuss with your psychologist, you have an epiphany. Quote, I resent my father, end quote. In this case, you seem to reason not only reflectively, but self-consciously. The thoughts and feelings you reflected on were clearly represented as your thoughts and feelings. Your conclusion involved a representation of you based on thoughts and feelings that were represented as yours. Sometimes it's obvious when reflection involves not just general consciousness, but self-consciousness. Peacock's, quote, reflective self-consciousness, end quote, is a clear example of this clarity. And Sosa sometimes suggests that reflection involves self-consciousness. Quote, he could always know such properties of his beliefs by reflection, that is, through mere introspection, memory, and reason, end quote. Even Korsgaard describes reflection as a form of self-conscious reasoning. Quote, the reflective structure of human consciousness requires that you identify yourself with some law or principle which will govern your choices, end quote. These cases of self-conscious reflection clearly involve conscious representation of, among other things, oneself, one's identity, or the contents of one's own mind. However, some scholarship is less clear about whether reflection must involve self-consciousness. Hilary Kornblith describes reflection as, quote, thinking about one's own mental processes from a first-person point of view, end quote. Here it's unclear whether the first-person point of view is itself consciously represented in such reflection. Consider another example from Korsgaard. Quote, I find myself with a powerful impulse to believe, but I back up and bring that impulse into view. Now the impulse doesn't dominate me, and now I have a problem. Shall I believe? Here, the impulse and the question about what to believe are clearly conscious representations, but it's less clear that the self is also consciously represented. After all, one retains the main point about reflection's impulse-checking function, even if the I, me, and my talk were replaced with third-personal replacements such as one, they, or them. When the self-referential language in statements about reflections seems so incidental, one is left wondering whether the reflection must be self-conscious or merely conscious. Section 4.3. Objections and replies to reflection without self-consciousness. Suppose a philosopher insists that only self-conscious reflective reasoning counts as reflection. How could a cognitive scientist respond? They may trade intuitions. Better, they could begin to document how common use of the word reflect contradicts this objector. However, one anonymous reviewer suggests that the coup de grace for the cognitive scientist may be to point out that the two-factor account has a place for self-reflection. It is a subset of reflection. So if the objector wants to use the word reflection to refer only to self-reflection, then they'll need to find another name for cases of non-self-reflective reflective reasoning. Nomenclature like reflection and self-reflection are not only inclusive, but far more efficient. Section 4.4. Normative implications about reflection and self-consciousness. There are two upshots to this discussion of reflection and self-consciousness. First, there's an opportunity for scholarship to acknowledge that reflection is not necessarily self-reflection. Thus, Second, the nature and normativity of reflection may not extend to self-consciousness and related concepts such as self-knowledge. So if we find that, quote, reflection on our beliefs and decisions distorts our view of our own mental processes, end quote, then this may be a problem for the normative value of self-reflection, but it need not be a problem for reflection more generally. Section 5. Mapping reflection onto philosophers' and scientists' theories. The current two-factor account of reflection as conscious and deliberate has promise. However, it remains to be said how reflective reasoning fits into philosophers' and scientists' categories of reasoning. Section 5.1. Practical and theoretical reasoning. There are various construals of the distinction between practical and theoretical reasoning. A prominent construal distinguishes reasoning about what one ought to do from reasoning about what one ought to believe. Korsgaard's account of reflection is explicitly, quote, practical and not theoretical. It is reflection about what to do, not reflection about what is found in the normative part of the world, end quote. Nagel's account of reflection seems to be compatible with theoretical reasoning because its aim is attitudes like belief rather than just action. Quote, reflective cognition requires the sequential use of a progression of conscious contents to generate an attitude, end quote. This compatibility suggests that an account of reflection need not in principle be an account of only practical or only theoretical reasoning. Indeed, conscious and deliberate reasoning can help us decide what to do as well as what to believe. Section 5.2. Dual process theory. There are many dual process theories. Some dual process theories are general, applying to all rational processes. Other dual process theories are aimed primarily at one domain, such as morality. Nonetheless, the general idea behind dual process theories is that we can distinguish between at least two ways of reasoning. There is some variation in the naming scheme for these two ways of reasoning. Some refer to System 1 and System 2 reasoning, and others refer to Type 1 and Type 2 reasoning. If we label dual process theories' duality with unreflective and reflective, then we might think that the present two-factor account of reflective reasoning adequately captures what other cognitive scientists mean by System 2 or Type 2. However, some words of caution are in order. First, some of reflection's cognates, such as critical thinking, will not map so neatly onto talk about system or type 2 reasoning. Importantly, reflection is a more general category than critical thinking. Reflection can be used for non-critical ends. Second, system talk might be misleading. Quote, reflective thinking is not something that happens in a separate system independent of the operation of intuition. Reflection is realized in successive cycles of intuitive thought, whose outputs are posted to consciousness, end quote. Even famous dual process theories have admitted that, quote, system talk is a mere, quote, metaphor, end quote. I find the system and type 1 or system and type 2 labels to be less informative and certainly less memorable than unreflective and reflective. So for these reasons and the reasons above, I express the distinction with the words unreflective and reflective rather than numerical systems or types of reasoning. Section 5.3. Rationality. Some dual process theories contain normative claims that others do not. Although reflectivists tend to think that reflection is crucial for good judgments and decisions, and anti-reflectivists tend to think that reflection's benefits are illusory, the bounded reflectivist admits that the empirical evidence shows reflection can be rational, but also unproductive or sometimes even counterproductive. Indeed, even the latest research on both humans and machines suggests that deliberately and consciously reconsidering initial impulses usually outperforms less deliberate and conscious forms of thinking, but being able to switch back and forth between reflective and unreflective thinking can produce similar results with fewer resources, suggesting that reflection can help, but it isn't always worth it, a la bounded reflectivism. So we cannot infer that rational thinking is or should be conscious and deliberate. Likewise, we cannot infer that conscious and deliberate thinking, or its correlates, are rational. It is not even clear, given how many of our seemingly acceptable decisions are made automatically and unconsciously, that we can credibly claim reflective reasoning is usually rational. So perhaps we can merely defend the claim that conscious and deliberate reasoning is often rational. If the benefits of reflection are relatively reliable only in certain circumstances, then we could argue for a sort of strategic reliabilism. But about conscious and deliberate reasoning, strategic reflectivism, if you will. Section 6. Conclusion. The meaning of words is often taken to be determined by their use. Some have argued that concept explication should also be determined in part according to utility. This utilitarian approach sometimes encounters trade-offs between the utility of a concept and its similarity to the phenomenon one wants to explain. To those who prioritize similarity, this paper can show how the two-factor account of reflection is strikingly similar to what philosophers talk about and what cognitive scientists measure when they study reflection. To those who prioritize utility, the two-factor, conscious and deliberate explication of reflection can unify, make sense of, and even guide both philosophy and science, both descriptive and normative projects. No doubt older, vaguer, and more confused forms of the word reflection and its cousins remain worthy of historical investigation. But the explications and evidence from this paper suggest that we should adopt the two-factor account's more exact concept of reflection. If you liked the Upon Reflection podcast, subscribe wherever you find podcasts, leave a review, or just tell people about it. You can also follow my daily posts about cognitive science on Blue Sky at birdnick.com, on Mastodon at birdnick, and all the other platforms. Comments and questions can be submitted at birdnick.com/contact. This episode's affiliate partner is Coursera. Coursera has something for everyone: students, teachers, schools, companies, and even governments. Find out how they can serve your education needs at the link in this episode's description.